Sophie Adler sat in 2A, her 12-year-old knees tucked neatly against the plush leather seat of Skybridge Flight 1067. It was her first time flying alone, and the early morning sunlight spilled through the oval window, glinting off the polished silver of the coat hook nearby. She wore her favorite hoodie, soft white cotton, and well-worn jeans, items she chose for comfort more than style. Around her, the other first-class passengers were already settling in. A businessman reading the Financial Times, a retiree sipping his morning cappuccino, a couple quietly discussing their upcoming conference in San Francisco. Sophie was the odd one out, but she didn't mind. She whispered to herself, "Just another adventure." She slid her tablet into her lap and launched into the slides her mother had sent. Details about their home in San Francisco and the small art gallery Sophie would visit that afternoon. Her mind buzzed with excitement, the earlier jitters about flying alone now tempered by the thrill of independence. She glanced at the attendant call button, then back at her seat pocket, where her salmon risotto ticket peeked out. Sophie had pre-ordered the meal days ago through Skybridge's app, and she hummed quietly, imagining the first luscious bite. Moments later, the low chime announced meal service. A uniformed attendant emerged from the galley, her crisp navy jacket starched to perfection. Sophie smiled politely and offered her ticket. The attendant's glossy name tag read Deborah Lenz. There was nothing unexpected about that. Deborah was a senior flight attendant, one of the most experienced on this route. Sophie thought maybe she'd be nice. Instead, Deborah's lips curled just slightly, an expression so faint Sophie almost missed it. "I'm sorry, miss," she said in a voice that was more cold than apologetic. "We've run out of the first-class salmon risotto. You'll need to take the kids' meal." She held out a compartmentalized tray, small chicken nuggets, carrot sticks, and a rice cake. Even the plastic utensils looked cheap. For a heartbeat, Sophie's brain froze. She stared at the tray, at the chicken nuggets that she knew would taste bland and dry, at the tiny carton of apple juice that sloshed when she shifted it. Then she looked up at Deborah, who was already turning away to help another passenger. "But I pre-ordered it," Sophie whispered. Her voice was soft, it barely carried. Deborah paused, hand on her hip. She half-turned, eyes flicking over Sophie's simple hoodie and jeans, as though assessing whether the child deserved a proper meal. "Like I said," she replied, voice steady, "it didn't go through. These things happen." And without another word, she walked off. Sophie sat very still, clutching the edge of her seat. Heat rushed to her cheeks. She glanced sideways at the other first-class passengers. Two businessmen raising their lids to taste caviar, a lawyer correcting his cufflink, an older couple laughing over complimentary champagne. No one looked her way or offered assistance. No one seemed to notice the mix-up, or even the girl in jeans being handed a kid's tray in the high-prized cabin. The injustice was sharp and sudden, like a cold draft under a door. Sophie felt her chest tighten and her throat go dry. She remembered her mother's words from the night before. "You don't have to shout to be respected, just know who you are." That advice had felt strange at the time. Sophie was used to speaking up when something felt wrong, but in that moment, she knew what her mother meant. She leaned forward and opened the tray. The chicken nuggets sat in neat little rows as though they belonged in a school cafeteria, not in front of a first-class seat. She picked up a single nugget with a plastic fork and nibbled at the edge. The taste was insipid, and the textures felt mismatched. Sophie forced herself to swallow without making a scene. She closed her eyes briefly, fighting the sting of tears. A moment later, she tapped her phone. "Mom, I wasn't given the meal I ordered. She said I didn't look first class." The words were typed out quickly, each one a measured step toward action rather than anger. She hit send before the attendant could notice. As the plane hummed its steady ascent toward cruising altitude, Sophie allowed herself one small breath. The air smelled faintly of warm coffee and recycled oxygen. She looked out at the vast blue expanse below and reminded herself that this was her journey, one she would navigate on her own terms. The chicken nuggets and cold apple juice sat untouched, a symbol of the disrespect she would not accept. On the other side of the world, her mother would see the message and know exactly what to do. Sophie didn't know the details, only that there were channels her mother could access that she couldn't even imagine. But she trusted that with one silent act, she had set something much bigger into motion. As Sophie folded her hands in her lap and gazed at the clouds streaming past the window, her heart settled into a quiet resolve. This wasn't just about a meal. It was about being seen, not for how she looked, but for who she was. And in that silence, tucked away in first class, Sophie felt the first stirrings of true power. Sophie stayed perfectly still as the plane leveled off, the gentle vibration of Sky Bridge Flight 1067 humming through her seat. Around her, the cabin settled into a hushed routine. Flight attendants glided up and down the aisle, offering refills of champagne and espresso to passengers she could now see were all adults in crisp suits and elegant dresses. No one paid her the slightest mind. The crisp napkin at her side and the polished aisle floor stood in stark contrast to the flimsy tray of chicken nuggets in her lap. She tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear, her throat tight but her posture unbroken. Sophie understood that calling attention to herself would only make the situation worse. She didn't want pity or a scene. Instead, she focused on the soft thrum of the engines and counted her breaths. In, 2, 3, out, 2, 3. Each exhale grounded her. She was determined to keep her composure no matter how unfair this felt. Across the aisle, a gentleman in pinstriped pants leaned over to his wife, whispering something with a smirk. Sophie caught the faint slice of their words, upgraded for the photo op, and felt a flicker of anger. But instead of letting it flare into tears or anger, she pressed her lips together and shifted her gaze to the window. The sky outside was a pale sheet of blue, dotted with fluffy clouds. She laid aside the chicken nugget half-heartedly and rested her hand against the cool glass. A few rows back, Deborah Lenz moved with practiced efficiency, but Sophie noticed the slight lift of her shoulder when she passed by the younger girl. It wasn't accidental. Sophie's heartbeat ticked faster for a moment, but rather than lash out, she closed her eyes and imagined herself back home in San Francisco, where her mother's living room windows overlooked the bay. She felt the weight of that memory settle in her chest, the reassuring warmth of her mom's hug, the soft hum of the city below. When the attendant cart rolled around offering dessert, Sophie picked at a tiny cheesecake square. It sat on a bone china plate, no longer the flimsy tray from before. Yet even this upgrade felt hollow. She wanted her risotto. But more than that, she wanted to be treated like someone who belonged in this cabin. This little girl with her head full of art galleries and school projects deserved that respect, but she wouldn't beg for it. She would earn it, quietly. Underneath her calm exterior, Sophie's mind raced. She thought of her mother, Nora Adler, a woman who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without raising her voice. Sophie pictured the curve of her mother's jaw when she was determined, saw the way her eyes flashed when she caught an opponent off guard. Sophie let that image settle inside her like armor. The injustice in first class was a test, and she intended to pass it with dignity. A few minutes later, Sophie's phone buzzed in her lap. She slid it open to see a message from her mom. Stay calm. Trust the process. No explanation. No panic. Sophie's lips curved into a small, private smile. She typed back only 2 words. I trust you. Then she locked the screen and slipped her phone into the seat pocket, out of sight. She didn't need to stare at it. She knew her mother was already in motion somewhere far below. As the flight attendant cleared away dishware, Sophie straightened her posture and glanced at her reflection in the polished metal of the serving cart. She saw a girl with clear blue eyes and a steady expression, someone in control. She thought of what she would say later, when this was all over, about perseverance and grace under pressure. But for now, she just observed the scene unfolding around her. The perfectly set tables, the soft lighting, the quiet hum of hushed conversations. The plane crossed into Nevada, and a storm front loomed ahead, dark and swirling. Thunder rumbled faintly, and a few drops of rain pattered against the window. Sophie leaned closer, marveling at the power of nature. She felt ready to weather any storm, even this one. She reached up, clicked off the reading light, and let the dim glow of the cabin lull her into contemplative silence. Through that silence, Sophie's resolve crystallized. She would not allow a single act of condescension to define her. She would meet every whispered insult and sideways glance with unshakable calm. And she would allow her mother's intervention to speak louder than any protest she might make herself. This was her moment of quiet strength, one that no one in first class could ignore for long. Minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing that they were beginning the descent into San Francisco. Sophie felt her stomach flutter, not with nerves, but with anticipation. She had navigated this challenge, stayed strong, and prepared for what was to come. Whatever lay ahead, an apology, a confrontation, or something far more significant, she would face it with the same poise she'd held onto in every breath and every unspoken thought. As the cabin lights brightened and seatbelts clicked on, Sophie's heart beat steady and true. The sky outside was clearing, revealing the golden glow of dusk around the Bay Area. And in that moment, Sophie knew she had already won, not in spite of the disrespect, but because she had chosen silence and dignity as her answer. Sophie watched Deborah Lenz move through the cabin with practiced precision, her posture impossibly straight and her expression politely neutral. Everything a veteran flight attendant was supposed to project. Yet Sophie sensed something colder beneath the surface. When Deborah paused at a fellow attendant's station to exchange a few hushed words, the young girl caught a quick flash of contempt in her eyes, like dark water shifting under a smooth surface. Sophie's heart sank, but she steeled herself not to look away. Deborah turned, noticed Sophie's gaze, and offered a tight smile that didn't touch her eyes. She tapped a finger against her clipboard as though marking Sophie mentally, subtracted points for inappropriateness. The gesture was almost imperceptible, yet Sophie felt it like a sting. A ripple of voices from first-class passengers drifted across the aisle, snippets of compliments to Deborah for her excellent service. But there was no praise for Sophie. It was as though Sophie didn't exist, and her presence in this cabin was an unwelcome illusion. In the few minutes since meal service began, Sophie had observed more than just Deborah's dismissive behavior. She'd noticed the way Deborah's nails were pristine, longer than regulation allowed, and how her uniform cuffs were always folded just so, betraying her penchant for self-importance. Sophie recalled overhearing a flight attendant trainee whisper, "I heard Deborah once got a complaint for calling a passenger trouble when he asked for extra pillows." The story had sounded like rumor, but now, in Deborah's cool, appraising glance, it felt all too real. Sophie didn't let her frustration show. Instead, she practiced the calm confidence her mother taught her. She folded her hands neatly in her lap and held Deborah's gaze for a fraction longer than polite. The attendant hesitated, her chin lifting slightly, as if startled that Sophie dared look back. Then Deborah looked away, smoothing her hair back behind one ear, and moved on. Sophie knew she had registered small victory number 1. A hush settled in the cabin as Deborah paused at the front to give instructions to another attendant. Sophie leaned forward and watched from the corner of her eye. She noticed the slight tremor in Deborah's fingers as she tapped a tablet screen, and the way her jaw flexed when the purser said something to her offhandedly. These were the little cracks in the armor, debilitating for someone who fed on control and perfection. Sophie committed each nuance to memory, knowing her mother's team would spot them too. Across the aisle, a businessman in a navy suit dropped his napkin and flicked it under Sophie's seat as he stood to grab his briefcase. The movement startled her, and she had to remind herself to take a deep breath. A moment later, he settled back into his seat without so much as an apology. Sophie felt the surge of indignation like a wave crashing in her chest. But rather than let it sweep her away, she practiced her breathing again. In, 2, 3. Out, 2, 3. She was safe. She was composed. She was watching. When Deborah returned to Sophie's row to offer a refill of water, Sophie noticed her colleague Ellen hesitate before pouring. Ellen's eyes flicked towards Sophie, then away, guilt flitting across her face. Sophie's steady gaze gave Ellen permission. She smiled softly and whispered, "Water, please," as though Ellen were a friend. Ellen's relief was palpable as she topped off the glass. It was a small kindness, but it rekindled Sophie's hope that not everyone here was blind to injustice. As the cabin lights dimmed for an in-flight movie, Sophie felt a familiar ache behind her ribs. It wasn't hunger. She'd pushed aside the chicken nuggets after one dry bite. It was the weight of being unseen and undervalued. She closed her eyes and pictured her mother's conference room, where big decisions were made without fanfare. Sophie felt the echo of her mother's voice. "You show your worth by how you carry yourself." She let the words sink in, steadying her resolve. Moments later, Sophie opened her eyes to find Deborah lingering at the end of the aisle, watching the screens on the seatbacks. For a heartbeat, their eyes met again. This time, Deborah's lips parted as if to speak, but she bit back her words and nodded curtly before striding away. Sophie allowed herself a small, private smile. In that silent exchange, Sophie recognized that power was shifting, imperceptibly but inevitably. As the cabin lights flickered to full brightness for landing preparations, Sophie realized she had reached the end of one cycle. She had witnessed the full force of Deborah's arrogance, cataloged every slight, and held her own composure in the face of disdain. The real confrontation was still ahead, but Sophie felt ready. She lifted her phone, finger hovering over the FaceTime icon. When she tapped it, she knew her mother would be there, poised and ready to speak on Sophie's behalf, and this time, everyone in cabin 2A would be forced to listen. The soft glow of the reading lamp above Sophie's seat barely touched the tension in the cabin as Skybridge Flight 1067 cruised at 35,000 feet. Sophie Adler sat up a little straighter when she noticed Deborah Lenz approaching again, this time with her apron and service cart in tow. A hush fell over the first-class cabin as Deborah paused in front of Sophie's row, giving the other passengers a moment to register something unusual was about to happen. Sophie's heart pounded, but her face remained calm. "Miss Adler," Devereaux began, her voice carrying a practiced courtesy that barely concealed impatience. "I've already explained the situation with your meal." She cleared her throat, making sure every syllable rang out. "First-class dishes aren't available when you're not on the proper guest list." She paused and glanced over both shoulders as though to say, "See how important this is?" Then spoke again, louder. "You don't get to pick luxury meals if you're not on the list." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Sophie felt every eye shift toward her. Adults in tailored suits, executives with leather portfolios, and even a couple in evening wear heading to a gala in San Francisco. The man 2 rows ahead nudged his wife and whispered, "Can you believe this?" The woman shook her head, a thin smile playing at the corners of her lips. A young banker in the back row let out a low chuckle. Sophie clenched her fists under her blanket of invisibility. Heat flushed her cheeks and her throat constricted. Sophie's first instinct was shock, but seconds later indignation flared. How dared Deborah make her stand out like a curiosity? The entire cabin seemed to be leaning in, waiting to see her reaction, as if she were a performance rather than a person. She swallowed hard and forced herself not to tremble. She would not give them the satisfaction of tears. She would not beg for her dignity back. She pressed her lips together, shutting out the whispers and the laughter that drifted through the air. Instead, she blinked deliberately, letting her calm exterior mask the storm swirling within. She remembered what her mother had said about power. True strength is quiet. It builds until nothing can shake it. Sophie straightened her spine and met Deborah's gaze. Still steady, still unblinking, the attendant's lips twitched, caught between annoyance and surprise. Sophie allowed herself a tiny, inward smile. She was winning this silent battle. Behind her, the purser looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot. Deborah noticed and adjusted her uniform jacket, as if reclaiming her composure. She clicked her tongue softly and turned away, nodding to the purser. "Thank you," she said, in a softer voice that carried only to those standing closest. Then she moved on, wheeling her cart toward the next row of passengers. As soon as Deborah stepped out of earshot, Sophie let out the breath she'd been holding. The cabin light flickered as the service cart passed by, and Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, pressing the palm of her hand to her chest, just above her heart. She could feel the rapid thump of embarrassment, but also a rising current of resolve. This was humiliation, yes, but it was not defeat. She opened her eyes and looked directly at the faces around her. There was a painter in a linen jacket, a tech executive tapping on his phone, someone flipping through a magazine. None of them offered an apology or a sympathetic glance. Sophie realized then that her fight wasn't with them. It was with the injustice itself, and she would meet it on her own terms. She reached into her hoodie pocket for her phone. Deborah's words still echoed in her mind. "If you're not on the list, you don't get to pick luxury meals." Sophie frowned at the empty space in her lap where the salmon risotto should have been. Instead of a hearty portion, she'd been given chicken nuggets fit for a child's lunchbox. She tapped the screen and drafted a new message to her mother, fingers moving with deliberate calm. "They just made an announcement about me. Everyone heard." She hesitated a beat, then added, "This is ridiculous." Then she tapped send. After that, Sophie slipped the phone back into her pocket. She didn't need to watch the screen. She trusted that her mother understood the gravity of the moment. The act itself, the public spectacle in first class, was Sophie's pivot point. She was ready for whatever came next. Around her, the cabin lights dimmed as the flight attendants prepared for an in-flight service break. Sophie leaned back into her seat, eyes focused on the window beside her. Clouds drifted by, illuminated by a sliver of moonlight. In that soft glow, she felt the tension in her shoulders ease. She drew in a deep breath, feeling the cold night air filter through her lungs. No longer a victim of the moment, Sophie sat with unwavering poise. The first-class cabin might have labeled her an imposter, a girl who didn't belong. But in that charged silence following the announcement, she owned her presence more completely than anyone around her. She was exactly where she needed to be, visible, calm, and ready for her mother's next move. And even as the hush of midnight air carried the plane steadily onward, Sophie felt a growing spark of quiet triumph. The story was far from over, but she had already claimed her dignity back. One unshaken breath at a time. The cabin lights had dimmed for cruising, but the atmosphere in first class felt anything but serene. Skybridge Flight 1067 hummed steadily toward San Francisco, yet tension crackled just beneath the surface. Sophie Adler remained seated in 2A, her posture unwavering despite the churn of whispered comments surrounding her. From the moment Deborah Linz made that pointed announcement, Sophie had become the unspoken center of attention. a silent spectacle in a cabin full of polished professionals. A businessman 2 rows ahead, a tall man with a trimmed gray beard and a navy suit, leaned toward his companion, a sharply dressed woman with silver-streaked hair tucked into a low bun. He murmured loud enough for Sophie to catch, "She's probably some Instagram kid who thinks she's special." The woman nodded, tisking softly. "Kids these days expect everything handed to them," she replied, her voice dripping disapproval. Sophie felt her cheeks burn, hot and painful, as if her very skin were betraying her shame. Not to be outdone, a younger man in a hoodie, some technology consultant, Sophie guessed, chuckled and elbowed the banker seated beside him. "Did you hear that? First class is no place for a 12-year-old. She should have been in the back with the rest of the riffraff." His companion smirked, glancing at Sophie's brown sneakers and jeans, before shifting his eyes to his tablet. Sophie's stomach twisted. The term riffraff felt corrosive in the air, more humiliating than the cold chicken nuggets she'd been given earlier. The cabin door to the galley slid open briefly, and a flight attendant peeked in. Ellen, the kindly attendant who had refilled Sophie's water. Ellen hesitated, then offered Sophie a sympathetic glance before closing the door again. Sophie saw the fleeting kindness, but chose not to acknowledge it. Instead, she kept her chin lifted, her gaze fixed on the soft cloudscape outside. She could not let pity or embarrassment draw her into tears. A woman in a silk scarf, seated directly across from Sophie, tapped the armrest and leaned forward. "I don't know why the crew even let her up here. It's a liability," she said under her breath. "What's next, toddlers in the cockpit?" The banker grinned, raising his glass of champagne in mock salute. Sophie's chest felt tight, her breath shallow. She tamped down the urge to rise and defend herself. She would not shout or curse or demand respect. She would remain composed. Beneath the surface of Sophie's calm, hurt blossomed like a dark flower. She remembered the feeling of her mother's hallway at home, where every piece of art on the wall spoke of careful taste and quiet grandeur. Here, in the middle of the sky, surrounded by strangers in expensive clothes, Sophie was stripped of that world, reduced to a curiosity, an imposter in a cabin that valued pedigree and polished appearances above all else. She pressed her palms lightly against her thighs, reminding herself of her mother's words. "Dignity is not given, it's carried with you." A gentle chime sounded as the attendants prepared to clear the snack trays. That brief lull gave Sophie a moment to steady her racing heart. She glanced at her phone, fingering the edge of it in her pocket. The message she had sent about the public announcement had already been received. She trusted that her mother was orchestrating her response below, but Sophie wished she could be the one to stand up and declare her worth. Instead, she exhaled slowly and looked up at the vaulted ceiling of the cabin, where small LED lights mimicked stars in a night sky. The image felt fitting. She was alone on this journey, navigating unseen forces. Around her, voices rose and fell in quiet judgment, but Sophie would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She would let her silence speak louder than any protest. Across the aisle, the man in the gray suit offered his wife a small bite of a caviar-topped blini, as if to celebrate being spared the supposed indignity of Sophie's presence. The couple's laughter, low and secretive, felt like arrows. Sophie swallowed the lump in her throat and reached for the half-eaten cheesecake she'd saved from dessert service. She took a deliberate bite, savoring the tang of fresh berries. She forced herself to focus on the flavors, on the textures, anything to distract from the barbs that buzzed around her. A moment later, her phone buzzed again. A brief flash on the screen indicating another message from her mother. "Stand by." Sophie allowed herself a small nod, as if acknowledging a strategic order. She slipped her phone back into her pocket and folded her hands neatly in her lap. The sheen of her own composure warmed her from the inside out, reaffirming the quiet power she wielded simply by staying unshaken. The cabin attendants began collecting the snack plates. Sophie observed each of their faces, trained to remain impassive, yet Sophie could see the ripple of discomfort as they passed her seat. They knew something was wrong, just as she did, and while they may not intervene, Sophie realized she didn't need them to. Her mother's influence would speak for her soon enough. As the final cart rolled out of sight, a hush returned to the cabin. The chatter subsided, and the overhead bins clicked shut. Sophie exhaled fully, feeling the tight band of tension loosen around her chest. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply be, to exist in this soft pocket of the sky, untouched by the petty judgments around her. Then, as the moonlight streamed through the window, Sophie straightened in her seat. She closed her eyes and gave thanks for her mother's steady hand guiding the next move. In this moment of silent tribute, Sophie felt a surge of pride. She had endured the whispers, the smirks, the outright contempt, and yet she remained unbroken. The cabin might treat her like an unwelcome guest, but she was more than its judgments. She was the daughter of a visionary, a bearer of unseen power, and her moment to reclaim dignity was fast approaching. Quietly, Sophie lifted her gaze to the front of the cabin, where Deborah Lentz had taken her station once more. The attendant's back was straight, her shoulders squared. Sophie knew the woman was waiting, for trouble, for an apology, for any sign of submission. But instead, Sophie sat perfectly still, her silence as eloquent as the finest trumpet. And in that charged calm, she felt the truth of her mother's mantra solidify. Real strength demands no spotlight, it simply is. Sophie sat back in her seat, the hush of Skybridge Flight 1067 settling around her like a soft blanket. The cabin lights were low, the overhead bins clicked shut, and the hum of the engines felt almost meditative after the storm of whispers and stares. Sophie's fingers tapped absently against the armrest as she stared at the cloud bank drifting below. She had just sent her second message to her mother. Simple words. "They're talking about me again." Yet even as she waited, the knot of uncertainty in her chest began to loosen. She didn't know what would happen next, and that tiny unknown felt both frightening and thrilling. Her mind drifted to the words her mother often used. "You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. Let your actions speak for you." Those words had always sounded elegant in the living room of their San Francisco home, where morning light streamed through bay windows and the aroma of coffee mingled with fresh paint on gallery walls. But here, 12,000 feet above Nevada, that advice felt like a lifeline. Sophie closed her eyes and pictured her mother at her desk. Calm, deliberate, impossible to rattle. She could almost see her, framed in the glow of a laptop screen, negotiating multi-million-dollar deals without a hint of drama, her voice measured but unyielding. A surge of warmth spread through Sophie's chest. She inhaled slowly and counted in her head. 1, 2, 3. Exhaling, she felt her shoulders drop. The unfairness of being singled out, of hearing strangers dismiss her, was still there. The sting hadn't faded. But buried beneath that ache was a new kind of power, the knowledge that she had set something in motion. With a single text, she'd tapped into her mother's sphere of influence. And now she would let that force unfold without interference. Sophie reminded herself her role was to remain steady. The real change would come from actions she couldn't yet see. She thought back to the evening before, when her mother had taught her to press her shoulders back, to lift her chin, to meet the world as her own person, no matter the context. Sophie remembered standing beside her in the grand foyer of their home during an art opening, watching her mother speak quietly but firmly to a gallery owner who'd questioned a sale. The gallery owner had frowned, shifted his stance, and apologized. Before the conversation was even halfway through, Sophie had watched it unfold like a lesson in silent command. That memory now grounded her. proof that words need not be raised when conviction is strong. As a flight attendant passed by, offering water and blankets to other passengers, Sophie sat perfectly still. She observed the woman's gentle nod, the way she avoided looking directly at Sophie as though unsure what to say. Sophie didn't resent that uncertainty. In fact, she welcomed it. It meant her mother's instructions were already rippling through the airline's hierarchy. Somewhere below, ground control was buzzing. Somewhere in a distant office, a manager was keying up emails. Somewhere, a decision was forming. And Sophie was content simply to be the calm eye at the center of that storm. She shifted her gaze to the other first-class seats, a businessman scrolling through stock charts, a retired couple planning their grandchild's college fund, a writer typing notes for a conference speech. None of them knew the full story. They saw only a girl in a hoodie and jeans who'd been handed the wrong meal and scolded in front of them. But Sophie understood that perception was fleeting. What mattered was outcome. She didn't need sympathy, and she didn't crave acknowledgement. Instead, she sat with a quiet dignity, letting her posture and her expression convey her unbroken confidence. The gentle chime of an incoming message broke her reverie. She tapped her phone discreetly. "Be ready." One word that felt heavier than any conversation. Sophie felt a thrill of anticipation race through her veins. She imagined the moment when her mother's call would come through on the cabin intercom, crisp and clear, commanding the attention of everyone on board. The idea made her heart flutter, but not with fear, rather with the electric satisfaction of justice served, softly but decisively. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and yet the wait seemed to collapse time. The lights brightened for the descent, and Sophie felt the plane begin its slow dive toward California. Her chest tightened lightly with excitement, but her face betrayed nothing. She pressed a hand to her heart, feeling its steady beat. This was her victory lap. Not a scene of shouting or tears, but a silent affirmation that respect could be demanded without raising a voice. When the call finally came, a soft but authoritative voice announcing, "Miss Adler, please prepare for a brief corporate communication." Sophie met it with perfect composure. She lifted her chin, smoothed her hoodie, and answered the FaceTime request. On the small screen, her mother's familiar silhouette appeared, flanked by a representative in a sharp suit. Sophie's quiet resolve held steady as her mother took the floor, her words small but monumental. "Ms. Linz, effective immediately, relinquish your duties." In that precise moment, Sophie felt the full weight of her internal journey, the hurt, the calm, the unwavering trust in action over noise. She had carried herself with grace, even when every eye in first class was on her, and in return the world had bent to her silent will. As the exchange concluded and Sophie tucked her phone away, she allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The storm had passed, and on the other side was a victory won not with cries, but with quiet resolve. Sophie's palms rested lightly on the armrests as Skybridge Flight 1067 glided through the thin air at 35,000 feet. The cabin was hushed, a gentle glow from the overhead reading lights illuminating each passenger in their private world. Sophie's mind, however, was anything but calm. She felt the buzz of anticipation like static under her skin. She'd waited for this moment. Her mother's quiet command to slice through the injustice. Yet the unknown still held its own electricity. A soft chime sounded from the overhead speaker panel. Every head tilted up, eyes searching the ceiling as though expecting a face to appear there. The cabin attendants paused mid-step, trolleys half pushed into aisles, trays of untouched nuts trembling in their hands. Even the flight deck seemed to hang on the edge of silence. Sophie could almost feel the thrum of the engines slow, as if the plane itself were waiting. Then, without preamble, a calm, authoritative voice filled the cabin. It wasn't the captain, nor was it an automated announcement. It was her mother. Nora Adler, speaking through the secure corporate channel. Her words came through the intercom with crystalline clarity. "This is Nora Adler, CEO of Attendant Ventures. Ms. Lenz, please step forward to the galley. You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Hand your crew badge to the lead purser." "Thank you." A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Sophie felt her heart hammer in her chest, a thrilling mixture of vindication and relief. No thunderous applause erupted. This was not the kind of spectacle her mother or Sophie wanted. But the hush that followed was heavier than any shout. Sophie watched Deborah Lenz stiffen in the aisle. Each muscle in the veteran flight attendant's posture seemed to seize at Nora's words. For a moment, Deborah's lips parted as though to protest, but she caught herself and squared her shoulders. She drew in a breath, sharp and restrained. Slowly, deliberately, she turned and strode toward the galley, where the purser waited with a tentative look on her face. Sophie noticed the gentle tremor in Deborah's hand as she unclipped her badge. Around her, passengers set down their glasses and magazines. The tech executive beside Sophie tilted his head, disbelief etched in his eyes. The banker 2 rows ahead whispered to his companion, "Did you hear that? She was fired mid-flight." The woman only shook her head. Her earlier smirk vanished. The hush was absolute now, the kind of silence you hear after a single, decisive gunshot echoes in a canyon. Sophie felt a warm swell in her chest. She hadn't demanded this moment with words or drama. She'd simply sat, watched, and trusted. Her mother's quiet intervention had done the rest. Sophie allowed herself a small, private smile as she watched Deborah return. The badge now clutched in her hand, her posture slightly bent forward as if carrying an invisible weight. She placed the badge gently into the purser's outstretched palm and straightened, the uniform jacket feeling suddenly heavy. The purser nodded respectfully to Nora's image flickering on the screen, then turned to Sophie and gave her a discreet, understanding glance. Sophie inclined her head in return. No words needed. In that look, they shared an unspoken acknowledgement. Justice had been served. Deborah drifted back down the aisle, her face composed but her eyes shadowed. She passed Sophie's row without a word, a silent figure removed from her station. Sophie watched her go, feeling a measure of pity. She'd seen Deborah's moments of vulnerability in earlier chapters, the imperceptible flicker of fear in her eyes, the slight tremor of her fingers. Now, beneath Deborah's professional calm, Sophie recognized a woman stripped bare by her own action. As the cabin lights brightened for the descent, Sophie closed her eyes and placed a hand over the spot on her chest where her heart still raced. The fear and shame of earlier hours had melted away, replaced by a quiet strength she had never known a 12-year-old could feel. She'd sat in 2A, handed the cheapest kids' meal, endured whispers and stares, and emerged with her dignity. Around her, passengers returned to their routines, fastening seatbelts, arranging pillows, checking watches, but none could erase the shift that had occurred. A 12-year-old alone in first class had become the catalyst for accountability. Sophie opened her eyes and caught a glimpse of the waning moonlight outside, silver trails of cloud drifting past her window. She felt full of relief, of pride, of the remarkable knowledge that her mother's silent coup had granted her. In those final moments before the plane began its descent into San Francisco, Sophie allowed herself to envision the next chapter. Stepping off the aircraft with her head held high, greeted not as the girl in jeans who didn't belong, but as the daughter of a woman who wielded power with quiet precision. She felt the truth of her mother's mantra resonate in her bones. You don't have to shout to be heard. Let your actions speak for you. And as the engine's hum deepened, guiding Skybridge 1067 toward home, Sophie leaned back, her breath steady, her gaze unwavering. The silent coup was complete, and in its wake lay the calm assurance that respect, once earned, could never be repaid with less than truth. A low murmur drifts through the cabin as Sophie settles into her seat, the night lights of San Francisco twinkling far below. The soft click of tablets and hushed voices signal something has shifted. She notices Ellen, the kindly attendant, staring at her screen, brow furrowed. 2 rows down, another attendant leans in, whispering, "Corporate's orders just came through. Our contract with Tangent is frozen." Sophie sits up, curiosity flickering. "Frozen?" she murmurs to herself, recalling the $970,000 0 advisory deal her mother just suspended. She glances at Ellen, who offers a tight, sympathetic smile, then steps away to confer quietly with Deborah's replacement. Sophie's heart pounds at the thought. Her single text has set corporate wheels spinning from thousands of feet in the air. Back in New York, at Skybridge headquarters, CFO Rachel Sims reads the urgent email from Tangent Ventures. Effective immediately, suspend and terminate all advisory contracts. $970,000, 0 cents total. She blinks at her screen, stomach sinking. That's nearly $1 million off the books. She shoves her chair back and dials operations. What the hell happened on Flight 1067? On the other end, Mark Lutz, head of investor relations, scrambles to gather intel. His palms sweat as he flips through crew logs and service reports. "I'm checking now," he says into his phone, voice shaky. "Yes, ma'am. They mention a breach of service protocol. Something about a passenger complaint and immediate action from a corporate stakeholder." Within minutes, an internal memo zips through the marketing and communications team. Elena Martin, Skybridge's communications director, gathers her staff in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the East River. "We need a press statement. 0 tolerance for discrimination," she instructs, nodding to her junior writers. "Emphasize our commitment to respectful service. N flag Flight 1067 for a formal audit once it lands." At Denver Dispatch, a blinking red icon appears next to 1067 AOS to SFO on the digital board. Ground Operations Manager Carlos Vega leans in, reading the alert. "Pending compliance audit, priority boarding crew check." He taps his radio handset. "SFO ground crew, stage an inspection detail at Gate 12. Crew must remain on board until clearance is given." Back on Flight 286, Sophie hears a new announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, please be advised we will experience a brief delay upon landing for standard crew compliance procedures. We apologize for any inconvenience." The calm, practiced tone jolts Sophie. This is more than routine. She wonders if the compliance procedure will include video reviews or formal interviews. Deborah Lenz's replacement hesitates mid-step, glancing at Sophie before pivoting toward the galley. Sophie notes the crack in the attendant's professional facade. Anxiety in her stride. The young attendant whispers to her partner, "I've never seen anything like this. They're auditing us before we even touch the jet bridge." Sophie's chest tightens, but she feels no fear, only a quiet sense of awe. She marvels at how a mother's silent text unleashed a corporate storm. All around her, flight attendants tap commands into screens, forwarding reports, confirming that every member of the cabin crew is now under immediate review. Even the lead purser's hands tremble slightly as she reshuffles paperwork. In first class, the mood has shifted entirely. Passengers press their seats upright, as though bracing for landing, but eyes flick towards Sophie, some with sympathy, others with newfound respect. A businessman in a charcoal suit offers a slight nod as he leans past her to gaze out the window at the Golden Bay lights. Sophie returns a steady gaze, accepting the unspoken apology. Her phone buzzes again. "Well done, nearly there." reads her mother's brief text. Sophie's lips curve into a small, private smile. She tucks the phone away, knowing the worst of the storm has passed. All that remains is to touch down and watch the final act unfold on the tarmac. Below, in the communications bullpen, Alina Martin taps out the press release's final line. Skybridge Airlines reaffirms its dedication to equitable treatment for all passengers, effective immediately, with enhanced compliance protocols for frontline staff. She hits send and exhales, feeling the gravity of public accountability settle over the airline. Meanwhile, at Gate 12 in San Francisco, ground supervisors wheel carts of documentation toward the waiting crew, clipboards in hand. A silver badge flashes at Sophie's level, a subtle reminder that rules don't discriminate by age or gender. She watches as the cabin doors slide open, the late-night glow of Bay Area tarmac flooding in. In that moment, Sophie's heart swells with a serene triumph. She's witnessed the full arc, from an unjust denial of her meal to the cascading corporate response, all unfolding quietly, but with seismic impact. Her mother's power, wielded through a simple message, has sparked change that echoes through boardrooms, dispatch centers, and press rooms alike. As the plane taxis toward Gate 12, Sophie straightens her hoodie and inhales the cool night air filtering in through the open door. Behind her, the crew stands assembled, awaiting inspection. Around her, first-class passengers gather belongings, murmuring about the unprecedented audit, and Sophie, small yet unbowed, already feels the afterglow of justice served. Not with shouts or spectacle, but with deliberate, unstoppable force. The ripple continues, but Sophie sits upright, calm as ever. Proof that true strength doesn't need noise to make waves. Deborah Lenz retreated to the small crew rest area just off the galley, her uniform jacket clenched in one trembling hand. The soft hum of the cabin engines felt distant here, as if the plane itself were trying to escape the tension that now clung to every inch of Skybridge Flight 1067. She sank onto the narrow jump seat, heart hammering so loudly it was nearly deafening. Minutes ago, she had handed over her badge in stunned silence, obeying the FaceTime order from some faceless corporate authority. She still couldn't believe it. Fired, midair, on a flight she'd commanded for years. And it felt all too public. Every passenger in first class had witnessed it. The calm, collected dismissal of the flight attendant they respected. She closed her eyes, pressing her temples against the back of her hand. Memories flashed unbidden. The staff meeting 6 months ago where a manager had cautioned her about offhand remarks to passengers. The nameless voicemails from HR she'd ignored about service complaints. The way she'd laughed with colleagues about riffraff, upgrades. These incidents now felt like landmines she'd carelessly planted. A soft knock on the door startled her. Purser Ellen slipped in, folding her hands in front of her. Her eyes were gentle, but filled with concern. "Deborah," she said softly. "The ground crew's waiting at Gate 12. They need the full incident report, and then there's the compliance audit." Deborah swallowed hard. The words compliance audit and incident report felt like icy fingers wrapping around her spine. What about the rest of the crew?" she managed, voice barely above a whisper. Ellen shook her head. "They've flagged the entire cabin team. Every badge, every flight log, every service report on this flight will be reviewed. Corporate wants answers before the plane even stops rolling." Deborah's breath hitched. She had always prided herself on flawless service, even if, behind closed doors, she'd let her biases slip. Now those biases threatened not just her career, but her colleagues' reputations too. The weight of that guilt pressed down on her, making her chest ache. She unfolded her uniform jacket and smoothed it over her shoulders, as though trying to reclaim some fragment of dignity, but it felt like armor that no longer fit. The epaulets at her shoulders looked mocking now, symbols of authority she'd lost. She unfastened the top button of her blouse, letting the stifling tension ease slightly. Ellen placed a hand on her arm. "You need to get yourself together before we land. They'll expect a statement and you'll have to cooperate with the audit. If you're honest, it might help." Deborah nodded, though her vision blurred with unshed tears. She had never been the kind of person to crack under pressure, or so she'd thought. Now, staring at the laminated safety card pinned to the wall, she realized how fragile command could be. A chime from the cockpit intercom signaled the start of the descent briefing. The captain's voice came through the speaker, clipped and professional. "All crew, prepare for landing. Crew compliance audit begins upon arrival at Gate 12. Deborah exhaled clouds of tension. Landing in San Francisco was only the beginning. She, along with everyone on her team, would face interviews, root cause analyses, perhaps even legal scrutiny over the charge of discrimination. She glanced at Ellen again, eyes pleading. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice cracking. "I never meant." Ellen shook her head. "Right now, we focus on moving forward. Acknowledge the mistakes, answer their questions. It's the smallest chance we have to salvage something." Deborah let out a broken sigh. She rose from the jump seat, smoothing her skirt and tucking her hair behind her ear. Each movement felt painfully deliberate, as though she were walking through water. She stepped back into the aisle, the cabin lights flickering to welcome returning passengers as they braced for touchdown. Passengers began fastening seatbelts, and Sophie Adler sat in 2A with the quiet composure that had undone Deborah's world. For a moment, their eyes met. Sophie offered a steady, unspeaking nod. No triumph, no malice, just acknowledgement. Deborah felt a sharp pang of regret and something deeper, the understanding that the child before her had wielded true power without ever standing. The rest of the cabin crew emerged from the galley. Each attendant's face was a mask of apprehension. Some avoided eye contact with Deborah, while others shot her sympathetic glances. She lifted a hand in a meek gesture of solidarity, but it felt hollow. They all knew the audit would leave no one untouched. Row by row, ground supervisors would board, clipboard in hand, inspecting credentials, reviewing service logs, examining video footage from cabin cameras. They would question her about every decision made, every phrase uttered. Deborah wondered how she would explain her offhand remark about kids not belonging in first class. No canned apology would suffice. A final announcement rang out. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated, with your seat belts fastened as we prepare for landing. Crew, secure the cabin for arrival." Deborah took a slow, steadying breath. She would have to confront her own failures head-on, to admit where she'd been wrong, to own the impact of her words. She fumbled for her badge holder, now empty, and tucked it into her purse. She traced the outline with one finger. As the seatbelt sign blinked off and the plane's wheels hummed against the tarmac, Deborah realized the journey ahead would be longer than any flight. She was about to face a world that no longer turned solely on service protocols and polite smiles. Instead, it would demand accountability, empathy, and genuine change. Stepping into the cool night of San Francisco's Bay Area, the engines powering down behind her, she took her first fragile step toward atonement. The sky outside was vast and open, but in that moment, Deborah felt the smallest she ever had. And with that, she understood. True power belonged not to those who enforced rules, but to those who owned their mistakes and dared to make amends. Skybridge Flight 1067 rolled smoothly onto taxiway Oscar, engines roaring softly against the night air of San Francisco International. Sophie tightened her seatbelt as the cabin lights brightened for disembarkation. Below the passenger windows, she could see the glow of floodlights and the polished metal of jet bridges. The gentle click of seatbacks shifting echoed around her. In that moment, anticipation hummed through the cabin like static. Sophie knew the real confrontation was about to unfold, not in hushed whispers at 35,000 feet, but out here on the tense, open tarmac. The captain's voice came over the... "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. A corporate compliance team and ground investigators are waiting at Gate 12. We appreciate your cooperation in remaining on board until all crew have been accounted for." A murmur passed through the first-class cabin. Goldberg, the lead purser, rose and moved briskly toward Deborah Lenz. Sophie watched from 2A as Deborah stiffened, her posture rigid with dread. In quiet urgency, Goldberg whispered into Deborah's ear, "Mrs. Lenz, please follow me to the jet bridge. Corporate security and investigator Roland from Tangent Ventures are waiting." Deborah swallowed hard. She glanced at Sophie, eyes wide, mouth trembling as if she were about to speak, then thought better of it. She nodded, drawing a shuddering breath. The entire cabin felt suspended in that instant. Passengers abandoned their luggage on their laps, their gaze fixated on Deborah's slow, measured steps down the aisle. Each footfall seemed to reverberate through every polished leather seat. When Deborah stepped onto the jet bridge, the metal corridor seemed impossibly narrow. At its end, 3 figures stood under the harsh, fluorescent lighting. Investigator Roland, a tall man in a charcoal suit, badge clipped to his belt. Marisol Vega, Skybridge's HR director, clipboard in hand, and Elena Chavez, Tangent Ventures Legal Affairs Counsel, her expression unreadable. Goldberg remained nearby, posture respectful yet watchful. Sophie caught her breath. It was the tableau of a boardroom standoff, relocated to a narrow aluminum corridor. A hush fell over the cabin as passengers craned their necks to witness what would surely become the viral moment of the night. The banker in the pinstriped suit across from Sophie leaned forward, whispering to his companion, "They're really terminating her mid-flight. Unbelievable." The companion only shook her head. Sophie felt a flicker of pity for Deborah, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this reckoning was inevitable. She thought of the rust-colored hoodie at home, the late-night talks with her mom about respecting others, and she felt a quiet swell of gratitude. This was the payoff for her own steadfast calm. Onto the jet bridge, Investigator Roland stepped forward. His voice was soft but carried every inch the authority of his title. "Ms. Lenz, you are hereby suspended pending the outcome of a full internal investigation. Please surrender your Skybridge badge and crew credentials." Deborah's hand trembled as she unclipped her badge. Her glossy name tag, once a symbol of her status, now dangled like a shamed badge of dishonor. She set it gently onto the outstretched palm of Marisol Vega, who nodded curtly and tucked it into her clipboard. Then Elena Chavez cleared her throat. "You will meet with us in the SFO HR suite after landing. Please refrain from contacting any Skybridge personnel until directed." Deborah bowed her head and whispered, "Yes, ma'am," her voice barely audible against the whir of hydraulic doors opening. She turned and walked down a side corridor, leaving behind the stunned hush of first class. Each step was a surrender. Her uniform jacket flapped slightly, the epaulets brushing her arms like faded metals. The finality of each footfall weighed heavier than any apology she could have offered. Back in the cabin, passengers exhaled in unison. The retired couple exchanged wide eyes and soft gasps. The tech consultant brushed an apologetic hand across his jacket lapel. Sophie sat perfectly still. She felt the power of the moment settle in her bones. How a girl's poised silence could trigger upheaval in corporate and cabin alike. She pressed her palms to her lap and watched the doors swing closed behind Deborah, as though sealing away the injustice forever. Moments later, the jet bridge retracted with a mechanical clang. The cabin door slid open to the cool San Francisco night, and ground staff beckoned passengers forward. As Sophie stood, she felt an arm's-length distance from the chaos, her calm intact. She followed the line of disembarking travelers, each footstep echoing her mother's mantra, "Actions speak louder than words." When Sophie finally set foot on the tarmac, the bay lights guided her toward the terminal doors. She paused at the threshold, turned back to the receding silhouette of Flight 1067, and allowed herself a small, private smile. In that reflective moment, she felt not just gratitude for her mother's decisive action, but affirmation of her own quiet resolve. The world beneath those airplane wings had shifted. Proof that dignity, once exercised with firmness and grace, could indeed change everything. With that, Sophie stepped forward into the glow of the terminal, leaving behind both the nylon seats and the whispered judgments. Ahead lay her mother's embrace, a world restored, and the knowledge that she had helped uphold the principle she cherished most: respect is non-negotiable, even at 35,000 feet. 2 days after that silent midair firing, Skybridge Airlines executive suite buzzed with urgency. In a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the runway, CEO Mitchell Grant called the emergency meeting to order. Seated around the polished mahogany table were CFO Rachel Sims, HR Director Marisol Vega, Operations Head Carlos Vega, and Communications Director Elena Martin. A single slide illuminated the screen: Flight 1067 Incident Review. Rachel cleared her throat. The Tangent Ventures contract worth $970,000, 0 cents, has been officially terminated, she announced, voice steady. We honored their request immediately upon notification. She clicked the remote. The next slide detailed the crew's disciplinary status. Deborah Lenz, terminated. 4 other cabin attendants, suspended and reassigned pending performance reviews. Ground staff implicated in protocol failures. Formal reprimands issued. Silence stretched across the room. Grant leaned forward, steepling his fingers. I understand this is a significant hit, both financially and reputationally. But our top priority is restoring passenger trust. We cannot tolerate discrimination, overt or implied. It ends at Skybridge. Marisol nodded, tapping her pen against a notepad. Our HR teams have already begun retraining initiatives. All frontline staff will complete mandatory diversity and customer service workshops before returning to duty. Carlos spoke up next. Operations has flagged 9 additional flights for spot audits this week. We'll send compliance officers on board and review all service logs, passenger feedback, and cabin recordings. His tone was clinical, but his eyes revealed the stakes. Everyone felt the weight of public scrutiny. Elena tapped her laptop. The press release went live at 600 hours. Social media reactions are trending, both praise for decisive action and criticism for the initial lapse. We need a follow-up statement tomorrow. Announce our new Respect in the Air program. Underscore zero-tolerance policies and highlight community partnerships. Grant exhaled, rubbing his temples. Good. Let's move fast. I want weekly progress reports on training completion, audit outcomes, and passenger satisfaction metrics. We'll take this as an opportunity to turn a crisis into culture change. Meanwhile, halfway across the country in San Francisco, Sophie Adler sat in her mother's home office, watching the live stream of that very meeting. Her legs swung from the edge of a leather ottoman as she sipped hot cocoa. On screen, definitions of inclusive service and images of diverse families enjoying Skybridge journeys scrolled behind Grant. Sophie felt a deep sense of satisfaction and relief. The world she had glimpsed from 2A was shifting towards something better. Her mother, Nora, stood at the side of the frame, arms crossed. When Rachel Sims mentioned the contract termination, Nora offered a rare smile of approval before quietly excusing herself. Sophie knew her mother preferred to let others give her the credit. It was typical. Maximum impact, minimal fanfare. Back in the boardroom, Minchell Grant closed his laptop. "We've paid a price, but more so, we've learned a lesson. Let this be the line in the sky," he said, voice firm. "No passenger's dignity is negotiable." As the meeting adjourned, the executives rose, forging a pact of accountability and renewal. The consequences of one flight had rippled through the airline's highest ranks and set a new course for every Skybridge employee. Later that evening, Sophie and Nora walked along the Embarcadero, the bay lights dancing on the water. Sophie slipped her hand into her mother's. "Do you think they really learned something?" she asked softly. Nora squeezed her fingers. "They did," she said. "And your quiet courage made them listen." In the glow of the city skyline, Sophie understood the full arc of her journey, from humiliation at 35,000 feet to the boardroom's turning point. It had been a quiet battle, but its consequences would be felt far beyond the cabin of Flight 1067. Sophie stepped off the jet bridge into the cool San Francisco night and let the gentle hum of the terminal sweep over her. Her backpack slung easily over one shoulder, she scanned the crowd until she spotted her mother, Nora Adler, leaning against the glass wall of the arrivals hall, arms folded and eyes bright. In that moment, Sophie felt all the tension of the past hours dissolve into relief. Nora straightened, smoothing the lapels of her tailored blazer, and offered a small, proud smile. Sophie quickened her pace until she reached her, and without a word they wrapped each other in a tight embrace. The noise of rolling suitcases and distant announcements faded to a soft background murmur. Sophie felt her mother's steady heartbeat, warm and unshakable, a stark contrast to the lonely churn of whispers she'd weathered at 35,000 feet. When they finally pulled apart, Nora brushed a lock of hair behind Sophie's ear and met her eyes. She didn't ask what had happened or demand a detailed report. Instead, she simply said, in her calm, confident voice, "You didn't have to shout. You just had to know your worth." Sophie nodded, a quiet smile curving her lips. That phrase had carried her through every indignity, from the cold handoff of chicken nuggets to the hush of whispers in first class. It was the lesson she would carry forward. Dignity doesn't need a megaphone. Behind them, the doors to the baggage claim slid closed, sealing in the warmth of their reunion. Sophie glanced back, imagining the ghost of Flight 1067's cabin, the polished seats, the hush that followed her mother's voiceover, and the weight of injustice she had flipped with a single text. She breathed in the scent of jet fuel and warm coffee, the familiar flavors of home. Meanwhile, in a starkly lit office across town, Deborah Lenz sat alone at a metal desk. The room was empty except for a single chair and a manila envelope stamped "Personnel Action." She stared down at the envelope, fingertips tracing the letters as if seeking an apology in print. Outside the window, the city lights pulsed with life, indifferent to her downfall. She folded her hands over the envelope and closed her eyes. For the first time, she understood that her pride had been her undoing, and that the quiet courage of a 12-year-old had toppled her empire of entitlement. Back at the terminal, Sophie and Nora walked toward the waiting car. Sophie's hand found her mother's again and she squeezed it. "Thank you," she whispered. Nora's smile was soft but fierce. "You showed them who you are," she replied. As they crossed into the glow of the parking garage, Sophie looked up at the bright San Francisco sky. The turbine lights of the runway still shimmered in the distance, a reminder that power can shift in an instant, carried on the wings of silence and resolve. Sophie Adler may have boarded Flight 1067 as an unassuming 12-year-old in a white hoodie, but when she stepped back onto solid ground, she carried with her an unbreakable truth: that true respect is earned by knowing your worth, and sometimes the quietest voice can echo the loudest.